Hello everybody, you're listening to the Polymath radio show with your host Daniel Aaron Levy. This is the fourth episode of a special I'm running on an objective guide to political ideologies, but don't worry, you don't need to watch the other ones to enjoy this one. Each episode is designed to be enjoyed individually by itself, and it will be fully understandable. If you want to optimize the viewing experience, you can watch episodes 9 through 11. So if you want that optimization, you do just that, but you don't have to. And in fact, if you want to really optimize your viewing experience, if you want to optimize the fuck out of your viewing experience, you can in fact watch episode 8 as well, which is a guide to what left and right wing actually mean. But you don't need to do that. That's all good. Now today's episode is what actually is socialism. Now let's get into it. Now socialism, it's one of those words which I think definitely more so than capitalism is thrown around more, but with much less understanding of what it actually is. And I don't want to give you a partisan or a doctrinaire definition of what it is. I want to use political science to just tell you what it actually is. I don't want to comment on how good it is or how right it is. I just want to give you the technical meaning of it. Now, socialism can refer solely to a system of economics. So in the same way that capitalism is an economic system, you can also use socialism as a word to refer to an economic system. Now, socialism in this sense, in a sentence, is when the means of production are owned socially and operated for social goals. Let's break down what all of this means. So, the means of production, what is that? It's a term which we often see associated with Karl Marx. In that phrase, seize the means of production, which is percolated into the public consciousness. But it's not actually a uniquely Marxist term. It's a term in economics in general. Now, the means of production is basically how stuff gets made in a society. And the means of production involves labor, the instruments of labor, and the subjects of labor. What does that mean? The instruments of labor is stuff like tools, factories, infrastructure, restaurants, kiosks, corner shops, supermarkets, etc. The subjects of labor is stuff like land, natural resources, and raw materials. And what's happening is that the definition of a means of production is when labor acts on the subjects of labor using the instruments of labor to create goods and services. Another definition of the means of production is sometimes taken to be the three factors of production, i.e. the three producer goods: land, labor, and capital. Capital in the form of capital goods. And a capital good is a good which is consumed not for its own sake, but the point of it is to make other goods. The point of a capital good is that it's needed for production and industry in some other way. It is in itself a means of production rather than the end goal of production. So an example would be machinery or metals needed to produce that machinery, or say steel beams or railways, things like that. Sometimes the means of production, well, colloquially I should say, not sometimes, colloquially, the means of production is often used to also include the means of distribution, which is basically how produced goods go from where they're produced to who they're meant to be, who they're meant to be produced for. Now, the means of distribution is stuff like stores or infrastructure or the internet. So that is what the means of production actually is. And here, in socialism, it's when the means of production are owned socially and operated for social goals. What does that mean? Now see, let's contrast this to capitalism, where the means of production are owned privately. What that means is that the dominant way of organizing enterprise in a capitalistic economy is when the means of making stuff are owned by individuals and firms and operated by them as their private property. Private property and personal property are not the same thing. Private property is ownership of a means of production. So ownership of land, ownership of labor, ownership of any of the instruments of labor or the subjects of labor, ownership of capital goods. It's basically private property is when you own stuff that is needed to make stuff for people to use. Personal property is just your own stuff. It's stuff like consumer goods, stuff like your furniture or your bedding or your clothes or your electronics or your toothbrush, that kind of stuff. So for example, a coal mine is a piece of private property. A lump of coal is an example of personal property. So a lump of coal, stuff that you can use to heat your home, for example. Now in capitalism, that's owned and operated privately. In socialism, that's owned socially. That's a very important distinction. So socially does not just mean nationally. Marx himself made that very key distinction between being owned socially and being owned nationally. Owned socially means being owned by society as a whole, or at least the working class as a whole. This can take on many different forms. So for example, it can take on the form of a workers' cooperative, which is basically a business which is co-owned by all the workers working in the business, and where all the workers receive a share of the profits of that business and democratically make decisions about that business. That's what a cooperative is. They can also be socially owned by workers' councils, which, for example, are just groups of workers that get together to make economic decisions, so they can be a trade union, but also often political decisions as well. So it can be a form of local government and a trade union. That's just one definition of a workers' council, by the way. The idea of a workers' council is a very broad definition. Fun fact, the word Soviet is actually the Russian word for a workers' council. Alternatively, when the means of production are owned socially, that can mean that they're owned by the state. But if the state isn't representative of society as a whole, technically, it's not being owned socially, it's being owned nationally. It's only being owned socially if it's owned by the state on behalf of society. But if the state isn't a representative democracy, or some kind of democracy, i.e. if it's a tyranny of some group over the others, then society as a whole does not own that means of production by proxy of the state. It's owned by the state of itself, and therefore it's not socialism. Now, many people would perhaps say that nationalized ownership of means of production is still socialism, even if the state isn't a liberal democracy. So, for example, many of the economies of kind of the 20th century socialist countries have been characterized as socialist, but they're not technically socialist because the means of production aren't being owned by the populace as a whole. Now, Marx used the phrase the working class to talk about the working class as a whole. That's because Marx and Marxism believes that throughout industrialization, as industrialization continues, the working class will become a larger and larger portion of society until it becomes like the overwhelming majority of society, and the working class becomes synonymous with the populace as a whole. By the way, that's a very important distinction, because Marx wasn't talking about, like, say, half the society sees the means of production. He was talking about basically all of it, apart from a very thin film of expropriators. Anyway, that's what owned socially means. And in socialism, the means of production are operated for social goals, rather than the accumulation of profit. You see, in capitalism, the aim of production is just the accumulation of capital for the producer. Capital in this sense is just resources. It can be money, it can be financial assets such as stocks, bonds, securities, it can be capital goods, it can be consumer goods, it can be human capital such as skills or education. Capital in just the broadest sense possible is just resources, stuff. And in capitalism, production is carried out. The aim of production is to produce capitalism for whoever owns and operates the means of production. It's also worth noting that the means of production can also include learning, research, innovation, and ideas. They can be intangible as well as tangible things. Now, in capitalism, goods are produced for their exchange value, not their use value. A great example of this is housing. Housing is not produced by capitalistic manufacturers to house the populace. They're produced so that someone can live there and provide rent in exchange, or provide money in exchange. The point is that the house is not being made as an inherent good in itself. It's not being produced for its use value. It's being produced for its exchange value. The value of the house comes from the ability of operation of the house or ownership of the house to be exchanged for money. That's a very, very core concept in capitalism. And another core concept of capitalism is the use of and the right of private property, which, as I said, is ownership of the means of production, i.e. a producer good. Now, in socialism, the idea is that this is seen as morally wrong. The idea is that the means of production can't just be used by individual firms or individuals for their self-interest, because that can massively come at the cost or the detriment of the social good. The idea in socialism is that the means of production need to be owned for the communal good of all. They need to be operated for the good and the health of society as a whole. The idea is that capitalism is an inherently selfish system because selfishness and self-interest are built into that system. Indeed, the point of that system is self-interest. So the idea is that capitalism consequently leads to economic inequality. It also leads to exploitation. It leads to some people being able to accumulate huge amounts of property and some people being left with very small amounts of property, and a very unequal power relationship between the two. For example, a worker in a factory working at minimum wage versus the factory owner who's extremely wealthy and takes all the product of that factory worker's labor, and who just kind of gives them a small wage in return. The idea is that capitalism therefore becomes an inherently exploitative system because people aren't actually equal. Even if in capital, often people are legally free to change jobs, socialism posits that that's not actually how it works in practice, because someone working in a dead-end job, surviving from paycheck to paycheck, isn't actually free at all. They are forced to work in a deeply unequal power relationship simply to survive. And the idea is that this leads to negative social results and injustice, and also leads to a generally poor society. And in fairness, in the early stages of capitalism in Britain, for example, the late 1700s and early 1800s, before there was much regulation at all, the condition of the people in the working class was genuinely very, very miserable. People were surviving paycheck to paycheck in deeply overcrowded and unsanitary positions where they're extremely prone to epidemics. They could lose limbs and hands in factory machines and receive no compensation. They worked by rigid discipline in factories at the absolute mercy of their employers. Many contemporaries visiting Manchester actually decried it for being Manchester, by the way, was a really major industrial centre in early Victorian Britain. Many, and kind of pre-Victorian Britain, so like Georgian Britain in like the 1700s and the early 1800s, many contemporary observers decried it as being really quite inhuman and leading to really significant injustice. Socialism fundamentally is conceptualized as a way of improving the quality of life of living in it. The whole point of socialism is to just create a better world for the people living in it. The point of the socialist economic system is that the community, the society as a whole, and the achievement of social goods such as justice, equality, freedom, liberty, truth, justice, humanity. The point is that the achievement of the goals by doing away with self-interest and ensuring communal ownership of the means of production is meant to be built in the system. Socialism is fundamentally about improving quality of life and rejecting hierarchy and authoritarianism. Now, this is a very important thing to emphasize because it's an early hint to the massive differences between socialism as in theory and socialism as in practice. Now, a lot of the time, socialism as in practice diverges from the economic definition of socialism in huge numbers of ways, and diverges from the political and social cultural points of socialism in huge numbers of ways at all. More on that in a bit. It's just important to state that socialism, unlike communism, still has private property. Private property still exists. It's just that the means of production are owned socially. So, for example, in a workers' cooperative, let's say a coal mine, the group of workers operating that coal mine, i.e. the workers, let's say they form a workers' council or a workers' cooperative governing that coal mine, they still all own the coal mine collectively. The coal mine isn't owned by society as a whole. It's owned by that group of workers. So private property still exists. It's just that the ownership of private property is transferred to those who actually operate the means of production, who are actually working in it, rather than those who simply hold the right to gain the profits from it. Socialism also still advocates the existence of the state, and it advocates the existence of money. This is all in opposition to communism, which communism supports the complete abolition of private property and eventually the gradual withering away of the state and money. Although socialism does generally still advocate the use of money, some socialists in the 1800s advocated the use of labor vouchers rather than money. It's really worth stating that socialism is a massive, massive umbrella term. It incorporates a huge range of beliefs and practice, but more on that later. So, unlike capitalism, which is just an economic system, socialism is a socio-political system as well, and is therefore an ideology. What is an ideology? Well, it just so turns out, ladies and gentlemen, that was the first episode of this special, and you can look at it in episode 9. But we're going to provide a brief summary of it. There are 3 constituents of an ideology. There's a political, economic, and socio-cultural constituent of an ideology. The political constituent of an ideology is basically how should political power be used? How should it be distributed? What is the nature of that political power? What are the limits of it? What can be done with it? The economic aspect of the ideology is how should the economy be run. The social-cultural aspect of an ideology is not just stances on social issues like feminism, race, LGBT, but also on much deeper and more profound ethical judgments and moral values held by that ideology. What is seen as inherently good? What is society aiming for? What do we not want? What values are we rejecting and what values are we pursuing with our policies? Now, socialism has a political component, an economic component, and a social cultural component. So unlike capitalism, it is a fully fledged ideology. Now, let's just look at the socio-cultural aspect of socialism first. Socialism is ultimately a form of liberalism. Now, we talk about liberalism in earlier episodes, really extensively in episode 9, to a lesser extent in episodes 10 and 11, and also in episode 8. But don't worry, you don't need to listen to them. Basically, liberalism is a socio-political ideology. It's also an economic ideology, but different forms of liberalism and basically prescribe different economic positions. But liberalism, for the purpose of this episode, so this actually is really only giving you some idea of what liberalism is. It's not giving you the full idea. But in liberalism, the aim of society is a free association of equal individuals, as opposed to a non-liberalist society, which doesn't see freedom or equality as inherently good. In liberalism, freedom and equality are seen as inherently good, and so are reason, truth, justice, and humanity. Humanity being the restraint of violence. In liberalism, violence is seen as perhaps sometimes a necessary means to an end, but it's never an end in itself. Violence is never inherently good. Now, I need to specify this because liberalism emerged in its modern form in the 1700s in Europe. Before that, since the dawn of modern states and civilizations in 4000 BC up until the present day, the vast majority of societies and the vast majority of states have not been liberalists, i.e. they have not conceived the goal of society to be an association of free and equal individuals. They have considered the goal of society to consist of a narrow elite and a large number of masses, wherein the goal of the masses is to be disciplined and obedient to act as a maximally effective tool for the elites to use to exercise power. And in this philosophy, freedom and equality are not good. Discipline and obedience are good. The exercise of power, the naked use of force, the use of violence are not seen as inherently bad. Indeed, it is the purpose of the elites of society to exercise the use of power in an untrammeled way. And the idea being that violence is therefore not inherently bad. And this belief system not only has been held by the vast majority of societies throughout all human history, but is also held by fascism, which is a modern political ideology which explicitly rejects liberalism. But we're going to get more on that in a future episode. For more information about non-liberalism and the societies that existed before the onset of liberalism and how everyday life in those societies actually unfolded, please watch episode 9 because it is actually really informative on this matter. I'm saying that as if I didn't make it myself. Sorry, that's kind of like, you guys ever seen the meme of like, it's like Barack Obama, like, it's like an interview where Obama like gives a medal to himself. I think that's what I just did. Not to be annoying or arrogant about it, but I just mean it provides lots more information on it, and I would recommend it for people if you wanted to understand more of an idea of what liberalism and non-liberalism is. So, socialism is a form of liberalism in that its ultimate ideal is a free association of equal individuals, and it ultimately cares about equality and freedom. The divergence with capitalistic liberalism is over the means of achieving this, because socialism says that capitalism, as seen when allied with the socio-political philosophy of liberalism, more of that explained in the previous episode, but basically capitalism, basically like the socio-political goals of liberalism allied with the economics ideals, the economic system of capitalism, is insufficient to actually achieve the liberalist goal. The point of socialism is that if you want real freedom and equality, capitalism can't do that. Because whilst in capitalism you may have political equality, you may have everyone being given the right to vote, as seen in the West during most of the 20th century, you will never have economic equality, because inequality, is built into the system of capitalism, because those who own the means of production will always be wealthier, and therefore more powerful than those who work in the means of production and provide labor for it. And therefore, there will always be a power imbalance. There will always be exploitation. There will always be the losers of this capitalistic system as well as winners. There will always be some form of inequality. And whereas liberal capitalism, i.e. liberalistic capitalism, basically says that economic inequality is acceptable in this society. in the form of civilization that we want to create, the economic inequality created by capitalism is acceptable. And just to be clear, there are lots of variations in what liberalism actually is, and different variations of liberalism will accept different degrees of economic inequality and will intervene in the economy to different extents to maintain economic equality. The point is that socialism rejects economic inequality to a far greater extent than capitalism, any form of capitalistic liberalism. So indeed, in the 20th century, we see a phenomenon where after World War I, most Western countries had universal suffrage. But the story of 20th century Western democracy can almost kind of be seen as this attempt to reconcile political and economic equality. Because while political equality was achieved, economic equality certainly hasn't been achieved. And testament to that, for example, is the huge weight of suffering generated every day in various countries by unemployment, by exploitation, by people working a dead-end job, by people being unable to make ends meet, by people working in a job that they despise but they can't get out of, by people working in a shitty job where they're completely subject to the whims of their boss. Every time someone gets sexually harassed in a job, for example, and can't leave because they need the money, that's the exact kind of injustice that socialism protests against and says that is wrong. We should not be living in an economic system where that can even happen. Now, the tragedy, I suppose, of socialism in practice is that as practiced in 20th century states, it's completely diverged from that ideal. Socialism in 20th century authoritarian states has not achieved a free association of equal and free individuals because the kind of socialism practiced and espoused and preached by the 20th century states hasn't really been socialism at all, in that it doesn't meet these basic definitions at all. But more on that later. Now, socialism is often conceived as a left-wing ideology. But what does that actually mean? What does the left-right spectrum actually mean? Well, it turns out, ladies and gentlemen, I talk about this as well. This is in episode 8 of Polymath, and I really would recommend watching it, but you don't need to. You don't need to. The point is that the left-right spectrums can diffract into 3 different axes, and these broadly correspond with the 3 different constituents of an ideology. One of these axes that we can diffract the left-right spectrum into is on the use of political power. And it's characterized, if we can call it the libertarian authoritarian axis, i.e., how much power should the government hold in the daily life of citizens? On the far libertarian end of that axis will be anarchism. On the far authoritarian end of that axis will be totalitarianism. The second axis that the left-right spectrum can be diffracted into is economic leftism versus economic rightism. This is not the same as being left or right-wing. The prefix economic is essential here because it's describing just one aspect of leftism versus rightism. So, economic leftism versus economic rightism is basically to what extent the government intervenes in the economy. At far economic right, we have the idea of minarchism, which is where the government only provides an army, a police force, and law courts. At the far economic left, we have the idea of planning, where there's no market at all, and the entire economy works by economic units, either decentralized or centralized economic units, basically determining what gets made and how what gets made is distributed. The third aspect of the left-right spectrum, the third axis that we can diffract it into, is a socio-cultural axis, based on we can call the progressive conservative axis. And this refers not only to stances on social issues such as trans rights, feminism, veganism, abortion, things like that, but also in a deeper sense on wider ethical values held by society. What values are good? What values are bad? What should we be aiming for? What should we be rejecting? Now, on all of these 3 axes, socialism's position on these axes varies within reasonable limits. We're going to be talking about where we can place socialism on each of these axes very shortly, but it's just really important to give a disclaimer. Socialism is a massive umbrella term. It has lots of different varieties, there's lots of different isms, lots of different practices, lots of different theories. So the actual position of socialism on each of these 3 left-right axes, there's quite a bit of room for variation, even though there will be certain boundaries set by the nature of what socialism actually is. Another complication that we have to deal with here is the difference between the actual definition of socialism and what's been done in socialism's name. And we're going to be talking constantly about the divergence between socialist theory and the actual practice of 20th century socialist countries, but This episode is about the theory. It's about the actual political science definition of it. Another complication we have to face is how the word socialism is actually used. And for example, some political scientists use socialism as a really wide umbrella term to encompass on one end social democracy and on another end anarchism. So sometimes you'll hear people say anarchism is a form of socialism. Anarchism and socialism are distinct. Socialism and social democracy are also extinct because social democracy advocates for the economic system as capitalism. But you will sometimes see people incorrectly using socialism as that kind of broad umbrella term. Socialism is an umbrella term, but it's not that broad of an umbrella term. Social capitalism, social liberalism, social democracy, communism, anarchism, these are not socialism. All of these buzzwords, by the way, have been or will be explored in this special. Another factor we need to talk about is Marx. Socialism existed before Karl Marx did, and there were influential socialist thinkers before Karl Marx who helped shape what socialism actually is. But it was heavily influenced and even arguably shaped by the ideas and the theory of Karl Marx. And we're going to get into what Marxism actually is and what the various theories of Karl Marx are in another episode. But many socialists are Marxists, and almost all of them conceptualize socialism in a Marxian way in some extent. Now, the definition of socialism and its relation to communism has actually shifted throughout time. So Marx and Engels, before around 1848 or so, actually used socialism and communism synonymously, as was normal then, but now they're different. We're going to be talking a little bit more about the etymology of socialism and communism and how they've diverged in the subsequent episode, what actually is communism, but for now we're just going to leave it at that. So, let's break down what socialism actually is based on the kind of three constituents of ideology and the three axes of left wing and right wing. Let's start with the economic position of socialism. So we're going to start with where the economic constituent of the socialist ideology and where it lies on the economic left versus economic right spectrum. So the central idea of socialism is that a free and equal society requires economic freedom and economic equality. But it's just giving everyone equal rights, just saying that everyone has the ability to become a billionaire isn't enough to actually achieve freedom and equality. The only way to actually do this, according to socialism, is by society as a whole reaping the benefits of production. And by society as a whole being able to take the means of production and operate the means of production for the good of the community, rather than having a society which is an aggregate of individuals working in self-interest. We can only achieve freedom and equality, truly, as according to socialism, by society as a whole being mobilized, being based on the idea of a communal action. Now, in this case, in socialism, enterprise, so the management and the control of enterprise is based on workers managing themselves. There's no controlling hierarchy. Every member in any form of enterprise, so in any firm, in any company, is a decision maker, and decisions are made democratically. Now again, in practice, this has basically never been the case in socialism as has actually existed. But that is the idea behind it. That is the political science definition of socialism. And here's the thing, in socialism, there's no profit motive. People are not making stuff purely for the idea of making money or accumulating capital. Things are made for their use value and not their exchange value. So things are manufactured based on the principle of how can this serve the community, rather than how can this be exchanged for capital. I'll give an example. Housing. Housing being manufactured by the exchange value is what we see in the economic system of capitalism. So for example, houses aren't made for the purpose of housing the populace per se. They're made so that they can be given to people in exchange for money. The point is that housing isn't made for its inherent value. It's made for its ability to generate capitalism for the person who makes housing. But in socialism, something like housing is made for its use value. It's not made to extract money from the person using the housing. The housing is made specifically and directly for the good of the constituents of society. Also, any surplus value, any extra profit or capital accumulated by industry goes in some way to the people. It doesn't just go to some narrow, self-interested individual or firm. Also in socialism, nothing is commodified. Now, commodification is a really key concept of capitalism, and it refers to how things which, for example, may be intangible or freely available or part of nature can become marketable properties. An example is animals, for example, how animals can become marketable properties, sold and bought for their ability to push prows or be farmed or raised as livestock, or to be sold as pets or for companionship, to be sold for wool or milk or any other products, etc. Another example of commodification is the commodification of nature. So, for example, in the UK, how you have to pay to see Stonehenge. Stonehenge isn't technically part of nature because it's man-made, but you get the point that I'm trying to make. The natural environment, the commodification of, so let's say creating a reserve or a park which you have to pay to get into is the commodification of nature, unless, of course, that park is man-made. The commodification of humans is also a thing that exists in the form of slavery, where a human is reduced to a piece of property that is bought and sold. And basically, the whole point of socialism is that nothing is commodified. Now, the social ownership of means of production is a way of facilitating all of these ideas. This whole thing of production not being based on the profit motive, of every person in production being involved in the decision making and gaining a share of the goods of that production. But the social ownership of production can be done in many different ways. An example is direct ownership by workers. For example, a workers' cooperative, which is basically when a firm is owned in part by all the workers working there. Another example is when something is communally owned by everyone. Now this, by the way, is specific to communism. In communism, all means of production are owned communally. So for example, like royalty-free music or open source media is stuff that in our current society is owned communally. In communism, everything is owned communally, so by everyone in society. So in socialism, the means of production can be owned by everyone, but that's just that's a category of social ownership. Now, the social ownership of means of production can also be achieved by the state owning the means of production. But this is only social as opposed to nationalism if the state is in some way the body/organ of the people. Now, 20th century socialist states did have nationalized ownerships of many of the means of production, but because these socialist states weren't operating on behalf of the public, they were operating as a narrow elite, an autocratic or oligarchic elite telling the public what to do. That's not the same as society as a whole owning the means of production, because in this instance, the state is not an organ of society. The state is indeed an oppressor of society. Now, when the state does own the means of production, but it's representative and actually kind of represents the people. So when the people own the means of production through the proxy mechanism of the state, that is known as state socialism. Now, more on the economy. The resource allocation mechanism of socialism can be either with a market, which is known as market socialism, or without a market, which is non-market socialism. What is a market? We talk about a market in the previous episodes of this series, but basically, a market is a resource allocation mechanism. It's basically when the decisions on what to produce and what gets made and how what gets made gets distributed throughout society, these decisions are made by individuals or firms, and these decisions are made according to economic rules such as supply and demand, rather than state goals or what the goals of the firm are in a wider sense. Now, a market is an essential part of capitalism, but varieties of socialism can also use a market economy. So, for example, in socialism, the profit motive is gone, but the idea of accumulating capital stays. The whole point is that the surplus value, instead of going to whichever capitalist happens to own the means of production, the surplus value goes to the workers who own the means of production. And therefore, because in Marxist theory, by the time socialism became a thing, the working class would occupy the vast overwhelming majority of the population, any surplus value being gained by a business or an enterprise is therefore being plowed back into the people as a whole. The point is that the profit motive, any accumulated capital, doesn't go to some entrepreneur who owns the means of production. It goes to everyone who's involved in producing the good. Now, an alternative mechanism of allocating resources is something called planning. Planning comes in many different economic forms. It's actually compatible with capitalism, by the way, in different ways. We talk about that more in episodes 10 and 11 of Polymath. But anyway, so planning. The whole point of planning is the use of the state or some kind of economic body to encourage development and growth in the economy to accomplish a state goal. So rather than letting the hand of the market determine what gets produced and what gets distributed. There is some kind of conscious influence. There is some kind of body which plays some kind of role in intervening to determine what gets made and how it gets distributed. There's loads and loads of different kinds of this, and it depends massively on the economic and socio-political system. Again, it's compatible with capitalism, and it's practiced in a mixed economy where private ownership of the means of production still predominates, and it's done for the profit motive, but planning can also be a thing. Now, socialism utilizes planning, but rejects the idea of private ownership of the means of production, or at least it rejects the idea of capitalist ownership of the means of production, and basically says that the working class should own the means of production. Now, socialist planning can be centralized or decentralized. In both, it's only actually socialist planning, as opposed to just planning in general, if the socialism is democratic, but it can be centralized or decentralized. Now, in central planning, the whole point of a centrally planned socialist state is that the role of the state isn't to enforce rule and to get people to obey the state. It's purely to act as an economic administrator. And here, the state decides what gets made, how it gets made, where it gets made, how that stuff gets distributed, and what the prices of all these goods are. And this, by the way, can be coordinated with computers. The whole point is that the state runs the economy to serve the goals of the state. And the goals of the state could be national development, it could be a high living standard for the people living in there, it could be equality, it could be social justice, it could be welfare, etc. The point is that it serves the goal of the state, and doesn't serve private interest. And in central planning, the economic decisions are decided at the top, and decision-making is a top-down process. Local units obey the economic units above them. Now, here's the thing. Central planning is an economic mechanism which actually has been practiced throughout history, but it's only really socialist if the state apparatus is democratic. If it's not a democratic state, then it's not socialist central planning, because socialism is inherently about democracy. It's just a form of central planning. So the USSR in the 20th century and its satellite states are often cited as an example of central planning. So the ideology of Marxism-Leninism is based on central planning. So the state makes economic decisions and local units obey. In practice, the USSR kind of diverged from its own ideology of Marxism-Leninism. Marxism-Leninism, by the way, is in nearly complete contradiction of everything Marx says, and is only loosely based on what Lenin says either, and goes quite beyond a lot of the stuff that Lenin said. But anyway, in practice, the USSR was run more as a command economy, where rather than the state promulgating rigid plans that the local units stuck to, the state or the government basically produced a plan to serve a general government directive, and local units modified that plan where appropriate, and that was fine as long as they were meeting the general government rules. Now, in theory, a centrally planned economy can be libertarian. In practice, whenever it's been practiced, it's been authoritarian and anti-democratic. Now, decentralized planning is rather than economic decisions being made from the top down, it's made in parallel, because the economy is composed horizontally, no one predominates over the other, they all make their decisions in parallel, of these autonomous, democratic, self-regulating units. And each of these units have their own mechanism for making decisions, investing resources, and allocating resources. Now, there may be a nationwide plan which all of these units follow, but all of these units are fundamentally autonomous. They do their own thing, and each unit is democratically governed. Now, there are many different kinds of decentralized planning. And decentralized planning, the economic units here could be workers' cooperatives, they could be workers' councils, and workers' councils, by the way, play both an economic and a political role in society. They could even be councils of both workers and consumers. They could be trade unions, and indeed the socialist philosophy of syndicalism is based on the economy being organized horizontally with trade unions. Now, this form of planning is more democratic, and it's been advocated by various schools of socialist, communist, and anarchist thought as the only way of realistically achieving democracy. The idea being that a centrally planned economy will eventually lead to whoever does the planning gaining power in the economy, and therefore having the ability to undermine freedom and democracy. This is exactly what has happened in 20th century socialist countries which have utilized central planning, by the way. So it probably is the only practical method of planning for actually achieving socialist ideals. That's enough about the economy. Let's now analyze socialism in its political stance. So as an ideology based on the nature and the use of political power. Actually, I just want to go back to something real quick. On that economic left versus economic right axis, socialism is therefore always going to be economic left, but the degree of economic leftism varies quite significantly. Market socialism is more economically right-wing than planned socialism. And in terms of whether central or decentralized planning is seen as further left, I'm actually going to look that up. I think decentralized planning is actually further left, just because that's what's advocated by anarchist economics. But I'm going to look that up for you guys. Hold on. Okay, I haven't found a legit answer, but that is just what I imagine. But keep in mind that that's based on my understanding of leftism and leftist economics and different schools of leftist thought, rather than some objective guide I've seen online. Despite the name of this title. I know, God, I'm clickbaiting you guys. I'm so sorry. Anyway. Now. So, yes. Let's now analyze socialism as in terms of its political power component and how libertarian versus authoritarian it is. Real socialism, so socialism as it's actually meant to be, not as is practiced in 20th century socialists, quote mark, states, is fundamentally libertarian. It is based on freedom and equality and power being held in the community. The whole point of socialism is that capitalism isn't libertarian enough, i.e., it doesn't sufficiently safeguard the freedom and equality of its population. The whole point of socialism is to provide people the freedom to do what they actually want to do. Because in socialism says a capitalist society can't be very libertarian because people who have to work jobs in order to live that they can't get out of are not fundamentally free. Now here's the thing. There are many different varieties of socialism and they will all vary on that libertarian authoritarian axis, but basically they're all libertarian. Now the only political power system that could feasibly ensure an actually libertarian form of socialism is democracy. Now, authoritarian slash non-democratic socialism has been often written about and is part of various theories. In practice, any kind of authoritarian socialism, I think personally, would rapidly cease to become socialism because a narrow group in power wouldn't have any interest in empowering the community. They would have an interest in empowering themselves, which is exactly what happened in all of these socialist or communist 20th century countries. Now, in socialist debates, for example, in the First International, which was this international socialist organization founded in the late 1800s, there were lots of debates over whether authoritarian slash non-democratic socialism could actually be a thing and could actually ensure real socialism. And there were lots of debates about how much authoritarianism was acceptable in a system. And indeed, anarchists and Marxists in the First International basically diverged on how much libertarianism they thought socialism would require to actually see it through. But remember, in practice, authoritarian socialism, while theoretically possible, in practice has just never been actual socialism. Now, again, massive divergence between socialist theory and actual 20th century socialism countries. Marxism-Leninism is a nominally socialist ideology that is explicitly based on authoritarianism. Now that is not actual socialism. Any socialist ideology which explicitly rejects democracy or libertarianism is not real socialism. You could argue it was real socialism if it supported democracy or rather, it supported freedom and equality, but just legitimately believed that a despot or some kind of centralized autocrat was the best way to do this. But Marxism-Leninism in practice doesn't really back freedom and equality. It backs hierarchy. In fact, Stalin himself admitted that the society he had created was composed of three social classes: the intelligentsia, the urban workers, and the rural workers. Now, any kind of philosophy based on communism, which admits to the creation of social classes and actively works to crystallize these social classes, cannot be actual socialism. However, in the umbrella of legitimate socialism in the libertarian authoritarian spectrum, there is still lots of variation in real socialism. The key question in socialism here is whether socialism is established from the bottom up or from the top down. Bottom-up socialism, or the more libertarian forms of socialism, is when the working classes democratically and independently seize power. Marx himself said that socialism should be, or communism and socialism should be established from the bottom up, i.e. from the people themselves becoming politically conscious, organizing in horizontal units, and seizing power together. And this is fundamentally libertarian and democratic in all conceptions, and it leads to a society organized by horizontal, voluntary, free associations. This, by the way, is what Marx advocated. So who is backing this? Some labels, some kinds of socialists which back this bottom-up conception of how to achieve socialism include left libertarian socialists, or left libertarians, libertarian socialists, anarchists. Now, I've said that anarchism isn't properly socialism, but some political scientists include anarchism under the political umbrella of socialism, syndicalists, and democratic socialists. Now, a more authoritarian conception of socialism is when socialism is established from the top down, i.e. a professional revolutionary vanguard party seizes power on behalf of the people. Now, this was advocated most famously by Lenin, but is also advocated by some socialists before Lenin, most notably a French socialist called Blanqui. Now, theoretically, this could be done to then establish democracy and real democratic libertarian socialism. But without fail, it has led to the revolutionary party who seizes power, then just establishing another dictatorship with them at the center instead of the old elites that they were replacing. It without fail has led to authoritarianism and divergence from actual socialism, which, by the way, was predicted at the time in First International debates by anarchists, who said, no, you cannot have a revolutionary party or any kind of vanguard seizing power, because that in itself will create a form of hierarchy. Now, Lenin had this doctrine of democratic centralism, which is when any bodies of state authority would be elected and held accountable to the general public, but that lower bodies, so local government, for example, had to unquestioningly obey higher bodies of government. So, first of all, the Soviet Union didn't actually do that because it wasn't democratic, but it was centralist. But the idea of centralism was criticized in the late 1800s by anarchists or left libertarian socialists or syndicalists and democratic socialists. That doctrine was criticized because the idea was that any kind of centralization, any kind of power of the state would eventually lead to authoritarianism. This is exactly what happened. Generally, socialism real socialism has degenerated and become some bastardized version of socialism which isn't actually socialism, when the engine pushing socialism forward is the state or a professional vanguard revolutionary political party rather than the people as a whole. What's most annoying / heartbreaking is when a bottom-up revolution is co-opted by a political party, which is exactly what happened in the Russian Revolution. So in the Russian Revolution, the people rose up in a bottom-up revolution and established Soviets or workers' councils, which were basically economic and political bodies, democratically elected and consisting of members of the working class. And Lenin and the Bolsheviks systematically deprived these Soviets of their power, held one election, lost, never held any others again, and then established a secret police to set up their rule, and then eventually established totalitarianism, and then set up one of the worst human rights abusing states in the 20th century. Now, another cleavage in socialism, but again, legitimate socialism, not actually existing socialism, is whether it can be established by reform or revolution. So democratic socialists are a kind of socialists who basically say we can achieve socialism without violence. We can go through the system. We can have people voluntarily vote and establish socialism. Now, more revolutionary forms of socialism, these revolutionary socialists basically say that will never happen because the people who control the levers of state, the people in power, will never actually allow that to happen. The only way to establish actual socialism and to overthrow the interest group, i.e. to overthrow the people in charge, would be with some form of revolution. Now, revolutionary socialism is the form of socialism that's predominated in history, and it has pretty much without fail led to an authoritarian state which oppresses its citizens and hasn't been actual socialism. History supports the idea of the former, i.e. the democratic reform means being the best way to achieve socialism. No country has actually achieved, I say achieved, I don't want to imply, because I want this to be a non-partisan guide, I'm not trying to imply that socialism is the goal that we should all be seeking. I'm just saying, in the eyes of socialists, it is of course a goal to be achieved, and socialism has not yet been achieved by any country. But the country that came close to socialism, closest to achieving socialism, actually just guess, just take a moment to guess. I'll give you a hint, it's a developed country. It was indeed Sweden, with a plan in, I believe, 1979, called the Meidner Plan. Let's just look that up. Which shouldn't be too surprising because, hold on a second. Meidner Plan, which year was that? I guess it just says 70s here. Or, yeah. I know, I'm not getting a clear answer. Hold on, I'm going to pause this and look that up. Hold on. Okay, so the Meidner Plan was advocated just in the 70s in general by the Swedish Social Democrats, a party in Sweden, that basically called for each company to channel a certain amount of its profit into socially earned wage earners funds, which would then be redistributed to the people as a whole. So the fact that Sweden came closest to socialism as actually existed, i.e. when the means of production are owned socially, and even then the means of production weren't owned wholly socially. They were still operated for profit and owned privately. Just a proportion of it would be directed to socially earned wage earner funds. The fact that Sweden, a country with some of the strongest kind of democratic traditions and some of the strongest trade unions and voluntary free associations of people, the fact that that country should come closest to achieving socialism isn't really surprising. Because something like socialism, a fundamentally democratic and libertarian doctrine like socialism, it makes sense, would necessarily require strong mobilization of the people, strong democratic traditions, a strong network of voluntary free associations, such as trade unions, which were associated to social redistribution and freedom and equality. The fact that Sweden should therefore come closest to that isn't really surprising. Now, finally, the third aspect of the socialist ideology, the socio-cultural aspect, and where does it fit on the progressive conservative scale? Now, real socialism is fundamentally liberalist. It aims for a free association of equal individuals valuing truth, reason, justice, and humanity. Also, and creativity. It is liberalist. It disagrees with liberalist capitalism on how to achieve that aim, but ultimately, liberalist capitalism and socialism share the same aim. It is that free and equal association of liberalism. Now, the values that socialism emphasizes are leftist values. Freedom, equality, truth, reason, humanity, creativity. Generally, the kind of values associated with the right are either de-emphasized by socialism, so order, for example, or actively rejected by socialism. So things like hierarchy, or tradition, or authority, things like that. Which means that socialism it's going to be more progressive and conservative. And indeed, real socialism in any era has been very progressive for its time. Socialists tend to be campaigning for real social issues. And indeed, actually in the 1800s, mass socialist parties played quite a significant role in either taming or pushing to the side some of the nationalism or bigotry of the working class constituents of these parties. Now, some socialists see socialism as a transitionary stage to communism. Some socialists just want to stop there. So as has been with the case with all of the aspects of socialism we're talking about, in terms of the left-right axis of socialism, socialism occupies a range of positions on that axis, all of which are progressive, but some of which are more progressive than others. But just remember, socialism is all about freedom and equality, and it is fundamentally a progressive ideology. It fundamentally visualizes a better world than capitalism, one where the economy and society and politics works for the free development of people as individuals, where people are truly empowered, where people can have a good quality of life, and where they actually have the right to pursue happiness. In summary, socialism is all about human freedom, equality, welfare, and empowerment. And that isn't some partisan definition. That was the explicit aim of socialists. That is the point of socialism as envisioned by those who are actually socialists. The tragedy of it is that socialist countries classically achieved none of these, and indeed created the exact opposite states. The tragedy of I mean, part of the tragedy is that even though socialism envisioned a better world to liberalist capitalism, in practice in the 20th century, you would have been much better off living in a liberal capitalist state in the West than living in a socialist state such as the USSR or China, which classically committed huge amounts of human rights abuses. The closest that any country has ever come to establishing real socialism was Sweden with the Meidner Plan, supporting the idea that real socialism has to necessarily come through gradual democratic reform and by a bottom-up process of individuals in society coming together in voluntary free associations and making change in a horizontal way. It needs to be driven by the people and not by a party. And by the people, even though in socialism this means the working class, socialist theory, which is, remember, strongly influenced by Marxist theory, holds that the working class will essentially be synonymous with the people as a whole, because in capitalism, the whole point of capitalism, as according to Marxist theory, is that the ultra-rich will kind of steal more and more wealth, appropriate more and more wealth for themselves, squeezing out the middle ranks of wealth in society until the vast majority of society consists of the working class, and there's a very thin elite of expropriators. Now that is a political science definition of what socialism actually is. And you'll perhaps notice that it's quite a utopian conception, and again, that was very much the point. This was explicitly conceived as a better world to capitalism. It was explicitly meant to be better. Now, debates on the feasibility of socialism are legion and rampant, but I think it's just really important to actually say what it really is, because especially in countries like the USA, which follow a more right-wing model of capitalism, any kind of government intervention in the economy, for example, free healthcare, tends to get demonized as socialism, when in reality, that's really not what it is at all. And I think part of being able to use your vote properly and to construct a better world and to be more aware of the kind of state that your vote is creating, I think a really important part of that is to know what these buzzwords mean and to know what these ideals are. So anyway, that is today's episode. I believe that is episode 12. That is, I believe, episode 4 in our 7-part series. We're going to be talking about communism, anarchism, and fascism after this. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening. It really means the world. I'm honored that you guys would listen and give me your attention. I sincerely hope you have a lovely day. Take care, ladies and gentlemen, and goodbye.